Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about why women ruin entertainment. And as I usually try to do, I'll give you my thesis right at the beginning. Why do I think women ruin entertainment? Well, I don't think they always ruin entertainment. I think they're ruining entertainment right now and have been for quite some time. And that's because, and just hold on to your hats for this because it's extremely controversial. And the fact that this is extremely controversial just shows the insanity of our culture right now. But men and women are different. And when men try to act like women and women try to act like men, you get confusion, nonsense, and if you're producing a product, an inferior product. And what do I mean by inferior product? I mean, simply, it doesn't sell well. And usually it doesn't sell well because it's simply not attractive as a piece of entertainment to whoever you're trying to sell it to. So, long story short, men and women need to stay in their own lane. If you wish to cross over that lane, which is possible, I'll admit, but if you wish to, you either must be at the high end, exceptional, or at the low end, at the very least be self-aware enough to know that you're changing lanes. So, a couple of things before I move on any further. Number one, I'm going to try and make sure this doesn't devolve into a rant. Number two, if you're disturbed at all by what I have just said, I'm sure there's a dozen different buttons on your screen right now that you can press in order to exit this video. But alternatively, if you're really upset with what I have to say, I suggest that you watch this video right until the very last second to make sure I don't say anything that might just trigger you that much more and leave like a dozen, 20 hate comments in my comments section because no one's going to read a giant comment of hate. No, you got to break it up to like 10 or 20. You go right ahead and do that. I urge you to do that. And number three, to add some insult to that injury, my graphic novel, Thomas Valiant, is still available. If you wish to get a copy, all you need to do is to email me. My channel email is rjs4thage@gmail.com. Just send me a note and I'll get back to you with prices and what's available and how much shipping is. Oh, and my email address is in the description of this video as well. And I suppose I should add a fourth thing to that list. And that fourth thing is that, and again, get ready for this controversial take, gender is applied to words, not to people. Therefore, I'm talking about men and women. And before I move on, I think I should also clarify that yes, I believe that men and women are equal, but equal does not mean the same. As I have said a number of times on my channel, equal is an old Latin word. It doesn't mean the same, it means balanced. So think of a balanced equation, a simple balanced equation like 2 plus 3 equals 4 plus 1. Now each side of that equation balances the equation out, but 2 plus 3 is not the same as 4 plus 1. Men are 2 plus 3. Women are 4 plus 1. Equal, but different. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some examples of this and why women ruin entertainment. I guess I should qualify as current entertainment. I'm going to start by talking about what I have talked about previously and their destruction of the comic industry, move on to movies for a little bit, then into entertainment in general, using comics sort of as my guide, and then back into comics themselves and the production of them, and again, how this destruction is becoming clearly evident to anyone who can consider objective evidence. So first off, as I said, I'm going to go over something which I've covered a number of times before, so I'll try to get through it with some speed. And it is part of the genetic difference between men and women. And I always credit Kelly Sue DeConnick, the creator of the current Captain Marvel, Carl Manvers, as my inspiration for finding this information out. Why? Because she was on an interview with ESPN. Don't ask me why. It was a whole thing. I'll link that video of mine in the description for when I did an entire video about that interview, if you want to go and watch it. But she was giving this interview to ESPN during the time that Captain Marvel, the movie, had just come out. And she made a statement with disdain and ridicule in her voice saying, like I see things with women's eyes, like women see things differently. And I usually find that these kinds of people, these quote-unquote progressive people, and by the way, she's a self-avowed intersectional feminist who also declared that comics should be used in a propaganda manner, I find that when such people use ridicule for something, they have no other way to argue against it, and it's usually true. So I went and looked it up, and guess what? Men and women have different eyes. Eyes have different kinds of cells in them. The two ones that you focus on with the distinction between men and women is M cells and P cells. Men generally have more of one, women generally have more of the other. And what does this do? Well, it allows men to filter out excess color in order for them to see shapes and movement better. And for women, they can't see shapes and movement as well because they can see more colors than us guys can. Or at the very least, they can perceive the distinction between very similar colors. And first off, where does this come from and why does it happen? Well, they think it happens because men were typically the hunters and they needed to focus on shapes and movement in order to be good hunters, in order to stay alive, or in order not to get hunted to stay alive. And women, on the other end, being the gatherers and the caretakers, needed to see if this plant was this shade of color or that in order to figure out whether it was poisonous or if their child's skin had changed from one hue of this to one hue of that in order to make sure they knew if they were sick or not. But the point being that, yes, from the moment of birth, no, not even the moment of birth, from the moment of conception, when your cells start to multiply, when there is a determination of XX or XY, whether you're male or female, these cells start to develop in a way that makes you particularly male or female. And this in part plays into another thing that they've done scientific research on. They've taken little babies from the time when they can first see something more than a blob of color and put various things in front of their faces and found that children are more attracted to shapes and movement, whereas girls are more attracted to human faces, which leads to a developmental process where girls are more in tune with feelings and with human relationships, and guys not so much on that, but are more prone to taking things apart and figuring out what this shape is and how this movement works. And yes, to that fellow who is typing in the comments, well, this sounds like something which is ingrained in human beings through their development, and therefore it can change. I would say, yeah, probably. It's something that can change. You'll just have to give it, I'd say probably a good 100,000 years to change, not changing in 1 or 2 generations like these quote-unquote progressive people think that they can do. But what does this mean for comics, and how does it make current comics bad entertainment? Well, you have in comics currently what I like to call a feminized color palette. That is to say, for me, a guy, everything looks like mud. All these different hues of color just blend together, and I can't see anything. In comics where I would say the best color palette was, which would be about 1981 to 1983, you had sharp, primary colors, and they were very distinguishable, and you, as a guy, could see those shapes that were there on this sequential art all that much better, and in such, when you had to connect that sequential art and the movement between each of those panels in your mind, it was much, much easier for guys to do so, because again, they could pick out those shapes due to the sharp colors, and therefore infer the movement that was happening between one panel and another. But with this current feminized color palette, you can't do that because everything bleeds together and I can't figure out where one thing starts and another one begins. And the answer to this problem, most women in the comic industry now would say, well, too bad. Comics are now women's territory. If not equally for men and women, more for women. But again, here we have a problem. Why? Because comics are more attractive to the male eye. Why? Because, once again, men are attracted to shapes and movement much more easily than women are. Women are attracted to feeling. That's why something like comics appeal primarily to men. Certainly North American comics, and that's what I'm talking about here, and I would say something like a novel is more attractive to the female. Now, that's not to say that men can enjoy novels and women can't enjoy comics, but on the whole, if you're looking for a story that you can fill up the gaps with all of your emotions, which women are typically doing, then they're looking for a novel. And at the same time, when you have men who are looking for shapes and movement, what is going to appeal to them? Well, the comic book is going to appeal to them. The visual is going to appeal to them. And again, appeal leads to sales, leads to, yeah, this is a good, at the very least, form of entertainment because it is entertaining these people you're trying to sell it to. And in addition to that, how do you make a good future product? Well, by making as much money on the current product as you can. And how do you do that? Well, you appeal to the largest audience that you can. Or at the very least, to the largest audience that is going to give you money for your product. And then when you make more money on your current project, then you have the ability to take more money and put it towards a future product and make it better. But what do we see with these current entertainment systems? You see a forcing of an idea that men and women are the same, and they're willy-nilly changing lanes, and women are trying to take over roles which men have traditionally used, and quite simply don't understand them, sometimes don't understand them even at the genetic level or how their bodies work, and therefore are producing something which does not appeal to most people, or at the very least to the general public who is going to give them money for their product, and therefore you get inferior products. And here's where I briefly answer those people who are typing in the comments, well, what about manga? Well, first of all, I'm talking about North American comics. I'm not talking about manga, but if you want to put that in the mix, I would say, first of all, North American comics and manga are two completely different forms of entertainment. Number two, you have to look at the fact that most manga are in black and white, and so there is a very different dynamic between the perception of shapes and movement in manga as compared with North American comics, which are almost entirely done in color. And at the same time, if you look at something like shonen manga, then you see massive amounts of movement lines and other kinds of visual tricks in order to bring the mind into this is the movement that is occurring and leads from one panel to another. And on the flip side of that, if you look at something like slice of life manga, you'll see that there's very little movement. There's a lot of people standing around talking, and there is a concentration on backgrounds that are very much there to evoke a kind of emotional, if not response, at the very least, setting for the reader so that they feel certain things while reading certain lines. Not to mention, of course, the fact that being a different culture, they have various different ways of doing all of this. For example, they have a plethora of different kinds of Japanese idioms that they can use to invoke an old story that everyone in that culture knows in order to tie in this story and where it's coming from and where it's leading to, or at the same time, another tradition of poetry that they use in order to play with language, stuff like that. But yeah, all of this makes manga a very different kind of visual medium than North American comic books. And so there is much more of a balance between men and women in manga, reading manga. But if you want to have that balance within North America, then make manga and try to do that instead of trying to take over comics and make them slowly into manga or apply manga principles to comics, because it doesn't work. Now let's move on to what seems like a completely different topic, but I'll try to tie them together at the end. Let's look at North American movies. And there's a great example of what I'm going to talk about that everyone has probably already seen just now, and it's the difference between Top Gun, which was made in 1986, and Top Gun Maverick, which was made this year in 2022. Now here's the thing. Men and women age differently. This is one of the genetic things that is the difference between men and women. And I know it's not the same for all men and women, and some women are an exception to the rule, but at the same time, it's an exception to a rule. And the reason I'm talking about Top Gun is, let's take a look at Tom Cruise in 1986, and then look at him playing this exact same role in 2022, which is almost 40 years later. He can pull it off. Why? Because men age differently. Now let's look at the female lead from the original movie in 1986, which was Kelly McGillis, if I do remember correctly. I'll give a picture of her from the original movie and from what she looks like today. You'll see that today, unlike Tom Cruise, for those people who don't watch my videos but just listen to them, she looks like a gray-haired woman who is showing her age and has a few extra pounds on her. She doesn't look the same as Tom Cruise, and she couldn't play the same role and have the same impact that you want to have in a movie. It just won't work. And why does it need to work? Well, it needs to work because, of course, men and women are attracted to different things. And this is, again, another biological fact. Here's the point. Men go for the prize. Women want security. Why? It's a biological drive. Men want to spread their seed as much as possible in the healthiest form possible. And women want to be protectors of the child that they are going to rear. I'm sorry if you don't think that way, but that's the way your body thinks. And this is what actually got me thinking about this entire thing, because yes, this is a generalization, but the point is that with those drives, men want to be heroes. Women want to be damsels in distress. You have a biological drive in either one of those directions. And the thing being for men, if that's your wish, if you want the prize in order to spread your seed, you do so with the most healthy individual possible. If you're looking for a healthy woman in order to do that, and that's how you do it, then you find a woman which is typically at the age between 18 and about 25. That's their peak. Yes, I know. They've tried to change the idea of where a woman's biological peak is, and have been trying to say for the last 40 or 50 years that no, it's when she's in her late 30s or 40s. Why? Because they've redefined what a woman's biological makeup actually is driven towards. They ignore completely the reproductive end of the scale and used as their metric the most pleasurable part of their existence. Trust me, you go through things like the Kinsley Institute. This is how they redefine things. But if you look at what the biological drive of a woman is, if you're looking at her peak, it's between roughly the ages of 18 and 25. And that's where men are going to find them the most attractive, because they're the healthiest in order to bear children, and that's what men want. They want that prize. Women, on the other hand, want security. I'm sure guys, especially guys who've been married and have children, have you gone through your wife coming home from the hospital and engaging in a nesting phase? You know exactly what I'm talking about. Everything needs to be perfect. Everything needs to be put in its place. Everything needs to be just right in order to maximize the safety of that child, because she's the one who is there to maximize that safety, to make sure that child grows up. And they do so by craving security. But again, the point being that women crave security. Where is the maximization of security within men? Well, it's not within young men. It's within older men, because older men have the experience and usually have built up some kind of a store of wealth in order to provide more and more security. So women are attracted to older men. Men are attracted to younger women. And again, you're looking at some kind of attractive appeal within your entertainment in order to sell that entertainment. And this, for something like movies, is a visual medium. And so, what are you gonna do? You're not going to put the gray-haired woman on the screen in order to attract the male audience that you know primarily wants to go see Top Gun Maverick. You're gonna take another woman who, at the very least, looks very young, which is why they chose Jennifer Connelly, which, again, she's an exception to the rule. And that's who you're going to put on the screen in order to attract the male audience that you want to sell this entertainment product to. Now, why am I going over all this? Well, I'm going over all this again because, you see, men and women age differently. And therefore, if you're going to be in the movie making business and you want as much bang for your buck from this star that you want to build up and use in your movie, what kind of star are you typically going to go for? Well, if you're thinking about the long term, you're going to go for actors, not actresses. Why? Because again, you look at Tom Cruise playing easily the same role almost 40 years apart. You can't do that with women. Again, there might be an exception to the rule, but it's an exception. I mean, look at somebody like William Shatner. What is he, 91 years old right now? And yet he can get up on a stage and I can still see Captain Kirk in William Shatner. If you take some of these women who are not even as far back as the original series, but in something like Voyager or Deep Space Nine, and you put them up on a stage, I'm looking at them going, who's that again? What? You're telling me that's the person that was in the show? Are you serious? They don't look the same. Women and men age differently. Therefore, who you gonna back as a movie star? Well, you back the guy because he has a longer potential. And Razorfist over on his channel made an exceptionally good point. With guys, not only do they age differently, but even when they age out and they become gray-haired old men, what should you do? Well, you take those movie stars, you slap a 6-gun on them, put them on a horse, and they got another 10 to 15 years of movie making right there. Why people don't do that right now, I don't know. It's most probably because that's too misogynistic of a genre to bring back into Hollywood. But what do we see? We see the force is female, and the new female-centric phase of the MCU. A female Doctor Who, a best captain ever female captain of Star Trek. And all of these kinds of things pervading straight through Hollywood, and everybody is just going along with it, saying, yeah, let's go in this direction. Can you see the woman, I don't even know her name off the top of my head, the woman who played Rey within the new Star Wars movies? Can you see her playing this exact same role in 40 years, and you still going, oh yeah, I remember her exactly, she looks exactly like she did? No, I can't see that. I can see Mark Hamill. You take Mark Hamill from the original first movie up into the new movies. Yes, the new movies are garbage, but I can still see Luke Skywalker in Mark Hamill. You're not going to be able to see Rey within this woman who played her originally 40 years from now. It's just not going to work. I suppose there's a silver lining to that, because if you look at everything we have around us for movies right now, it's just a rehashing of all these 80s great movies, and you're able to take some of those old actors and put them into the movies and give them some tie to that history, and therefore make a whole lot more money. With all these female leads in these movies trying to push this female empowerment within Hollywood, you're not going to be able to do that in 40 years, because they're just not going to be a draw. Now let's move on to my third example. And my third example, I think, can be applied to any form of entertainment, but again, I'm going to use comics as my backdrop because that's what I have the most information on. And this is something more cultural, certainly more cultural than biological, although there are biological strains underneath there. But it has been something which in intellectual circles, there's been not too many, but some papers and studies done on. And it's called the Cosmo ideal. And it looks at how culture has shaped the female mentality over the last 50 years. And they use as their head example the Cosmopolitan magazine. And just to give you a couple of statistics, yes, Cosmopolitan magazine is one of the most popular magazines. That is to say, of all magazines, not just women's magazines. Last I looked, I think it was still number 16 on the top-selling magazines. And funny enough, if you look at sales on universities, the top-selling magazine on university campuses is Cosmopolitan. So you have all these women going for their gender studies and other kinds of degrees, and what are they reading? They're reading Cosmopolitan magazine. Now that may sound weird to you, but when you look at the origins of what Cosmopolitan magazine is and how it feeds into this quote-unquote progressive mentality, it makes perfect sense. So really, Cosmopolitan magazine in its origin, it was a women's magazine written by men. But I think it was back in 1965 that this woman named Helen Gurley Brown, I think it's Gurley, Gurley. Anyways, she took over the reins as editor of Cosmopolitan magazine, and she stayed there up until 1997. And when she was ousted from there, she still stayed as one of the head editorial staff on the magazine for its international wing up until her death, which was in 2012. So she's had an immense amount of influence on what this magazine has been putting out for decades now. And she was most definitely part of the feminist movement, the quote-unquote progressive feminist movement. Back in 1962, she gained notoriety for her book, Sex and the Single Girls. So you know from the title of that book where that's going. But her basic mentality is summed up in some of the rules which she instituted in the magazine. They were hard and fast rules for quite some time. They got a little looser after they tried to get rid of her, but at the same time, they still pervade this magazine and the mentality in this magazine and have shaped the way that women think over the last 57 years. And her mentality was that women need to be powerful. It always goes back to power, goes back to a mentality of something like, I can't be oppressed, I have to usurp my oppressor, and therefore I need the power to do that. But it's all about being powerful. And where do women find their power? Well, they find their power in sex. And they do that by being attractive to men. And as I said, women are the most attractive to men in an area of time where they are between 18 and 25. And so she realized this and instituted within the magazine these standards where you could basically not talk about aging. You could not talk about disease or about getting sick, and you certainly could not talk about death. Now, again, there were some exceptions to this, but the point being that you had to convince the reader at all times that they were powerful by convincing them that they could be young forever. Because again, women at some biological level realize that, yeah, my power peaked at a time when I was between 18 and 25. So you want them to feel powerful, you make them feel like an 18 to 25-year-old. And by the way, this woman was very vindictive. She used little tricks in order to make sure people thought of her all the time as being young, and did things like using old photographs constantly in her editorials to make people think that she was constantly the same age. And when someone tried to call her out on it, she would explode at them. But anyways, the point being that you have now gotten 5 decades worth of women who have been trained to think that you need to be powerful, and you be powerful by being constantly somewhere between a teenaged girl and a very young woman. But here's the problem. Most women realize that they're getting older. So how do they substitute this idea of I'm extremely powerful, and therefore I, at the very least, trick myself into believing that I'm powerful and can do anything? Well, they do it when their bodies are constantly telling them the opposite, by having a mentality of a 18 to 25-year-old. And again, I'm sure this works for most forms of entertainment, but I have the most information on comics, and especially Marvel Comics. And this exact thing has taken over Marvel Comics. It went whole hog around 2012, when you got Sana Amanat becoming the second in command at Marvel Comics. She was hired around 2009 in order to change the direction of Marvel Comics, and she is very much ensconced in A, this fashion ideal, and B, the mentality that comes out of it, that women can be constantly powerful by being constantly young. And it just produces the worst forms of entertainment by having the women who are writing these stories certainly think in this way, where they, as 40 and 50-year-old women, most of them who work for Marvel, acting like they're teenagers. Just briefly, I'll go over some evidence to show you this is happening within Marvel Comics. First of all, you have Sana Amanat. She is obsessed with this idea of fashion, and it comes from, I do believe, an inferiority complex. On her own podcast, she referred to herself more than once as a dumpy brown girl, wherein one of her brothers, who was the golden child of the family, that is to say, before he was imprisoned for being, as the paper said, a serial swindler, because he was a Hollywood producer who produced a lot of the movies which you've probably either seen or heard of. But anyways, as a young man, he became a multi-millionaire with his software development, and then when Sana Amanat was in high school, he married a supermodel. And this most definitely gave her a complex and tied her directly to this fashion model world. And she was always, as the head of Marvel Comics or second in command, using this fashion model mentality. She even, during her stint there, was a guest editor, I think, for Elle magazine, which is a women's fashion magazine. On her podcast, they interviewed people like the curator of the New York Fashion Museum and tried to tie Marvel Comics in with all of the fashion throughout history. She hired a fashion writer for Marvel, who is still there and has been there, I think, now for about 8 years now, who constantly writes fashion articles on the characters of Marvel, that is to say, Marvel Comics. They had a panel of women at one Comic-Con where one of the women who does covers exclusively for Marvel talked about how covers are to show women feeling their feelings, and at the same time talked about how covers for Marvel Comics should be the equivalent of a picture window fashion display that would turn a woman's head so that they are attractive to women. Not to mention the constant push of cosplay, which just got insane at one point, and which is the cause of why most of the characters for Marvel Comics right now look like they're wearing something like a jumpsuit that you could get off the rack at Walmart. Why? Because that's what they want. They want people to cosplay and design their own fashion around the way that these characters look within the comics. So you have that. You take all of that fashion mentality, and then you add it to the progressive mentality that the women and those male feminists who are in Marvel right now and have all been placed there because they have a certain progressive mentality. You mix those two together, and what do you get? You get the Cosmo ideal just shining right through. Again, you have these 40 to 50-year-old women, which is the majority of women working for Marvel who are writing the comics, and they talk like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. They have been taught all of their lives that they need to be young in order to be powerful, and to be powerful is everything. Therefore, the only way that they can do that is to be mentally young. So they're mentally stunted, and they act like teenagers, and they think they're funny, and they think they're clever. They are not. Now, I know this video is getting long, but I want to give you just one current example of this. It is a perfect example of this mentality put down on a page. It is the fact that there is a new book coming out from Marvel, which the center character is Dazzler. There's also Boom Boom and Jubilee thrown in there, but they're really just all the same character with different variations. And the promotion material that they're using for it is Dazzler in her 1960s disco getup with roller skates on, blowing bubbles, and killing vampires. But here's the thing. Yes, I know within Marvel they have what is called a squished perspective, which is to say they tried to take all of Marvel history and condense it down into one lifetime so that their characters are 20-year-olds. But you have this character, which I've grown up with, and I've read a lot of her comics and enjoyed many of them. But the character has developed over time. She went from being a rock star to being an X-Men to being a rebel leader, which then got married and had a child. And yes, this whole story continues on after that, acknowledging all of that and saying, yes, she's going back to being a bubble-blowing teenager now. I'm sorry, that's not what she is. She's a divorced single mother who was once a rebel leader in an entirely different plane of existence. She can't go back to being a teenager. That's ridiculous. All of those things contradict the fact that you're making her down on a page an attractive teenage-looking girl when her entire history, which you acknowledge exists, make her an old woman. Those things can't exist together. It makes a ridiculous story and bad entertainment. Compare that with the interview I covered with Ann Nocenti, an old writer for Marvel who wrote for Marvel in the 1980s and 1990s. It was Sana Amanat doing that interviewing of her, trying to tell her how comics are actually made now. And Ann Nocenti had to apologize because, well, she didn't want to get canceled, but she said, you see, men and women are different, and North American comics end up with a fight, and she, as a woman, just wasn't prepared to write that kind of a story, not like the guys were. And so, in order for her to become prepared, she did things like go and take boxing lessons so she could learn how to throw a punch and how to take a punch. All these kinds of things she did in order to understand exactly what this conflict was, how it worked, how it played out in a story, all the things that she recognized that the guys pretty much understood naturally. And again, this is the self-awareness that I was talking about at the first. It's not that women can't do these jobs, but at the very bare minimum, you got to understand, you got to be self-aware enough to know that A, if you're going into a male-dominated audience, you're going to be writing for men and writing in a way that they understand best. And it doesn't just affect the storytelling either. It affects the way that the entire company is run. I did a video about a panel that Marvel did at a Comic-Con a couple of years ago, where they talked about the fact that they needed to shut out all kinds of negative voices, and especially the women on the panel. They're talking about, yes, you got to shut out everything negative. I'm sorry, but again, this is the difference between men and women. Men are looking for the prize. Women are looking for security. The only way they get security at that level is to shut out all forms of negativity. Guys, we're looking for the prize. Therefore, we're looking to get better. If you're mature enough, at the very least, you look at the criticism and go, yeah, that really stung. But either A, you say to yourself, I'm going to take that and make my product better, or you're most probably going to say, oh yeah, you think my stuff isn't very good? I'm going to show you. Again, it is that competitive spirit which strives for the prize. And again, I'm not saying that men don't have their own forms of this, their own forms of I want to be childish for the rest of my life. A lot of people think that video games and comics are an expression of that. But at the same time, I gotta say, there's a massive difference between Tom King writing his sissy Batman, who, like Tom King, has some kind of a mommy complex, and Jack Kirby, who grew up jumping from rooftop to rooftop, trying to avoid getting the living hell beaten out of him in New York City, or arriving on Omaha Beach looking at the piles of bodies that were there. But the entire point being, for all of these examples, is that entertainment is entertaining when it appeals to the person it's directed towards. Men find certain things appealing, and women find certain things appealing. And for the people who make entertainment, when men are men and women are women, and both act in the way that men and women should act, they understand these things. They can use that understanding to make good stories and good entertainment. When you don't, you have entertainment which at best leads to a dead end, at worst is dead on arrival. And to throw my own 2 cents in here, where do I think all this comes from? Why do I think women are the cause of this problem? Well, it all goes back to that eye structure. It all goes back to the fact that men, as children, they get attracted to the mechanical, whereas women get attracted to human faces. Women concern themselves with feelings. They are actually concerned with the feelings of others much more than men are. Trust me, I worked in an office with a whole bunch of women and a couple of guys. The women in that office really didn't like me. Why? Because the way they did things was they did things socially. They would chit-chat and ask about each other's families and talk to clients about these things and think that that's the way they built a business. I didn't. I competed. And I didn't care if I stepped on a couple of toes when I did so. Because I'm not going to lie to clients and I'm not going to lie to the person sitting next to me. I don't care about your feelings. I'm here to work. And it took me a good couple of years, but after that point, I was making more than anyone else in the room. And I'm sure at least more than one of you is probably saying, isn't your channel supposed to be about heroes and being heroic? This doesn't sound like a very heroic way to act. And I would say, yeah, it is. That's the thing about heroism, as I'm always going on about. It's about virtue. That virtue backs up into right reason. Right reason acknowledges things as they actually are. Sometimes the truth hurts. That's part of the reason why you have to have the virtue of fortitude. And we've gotten to a point in our culture where there has been an erosion of rational thought so much that most people have nothing left than their feelings. And especially most women, they have nothing left than their feelings, and that's all they proceed upon. And so when someone comes to them and says, I've been persecuted, I deserve a chance, they see those puppy dog eyes and use their feels and say, yes, you do deserve a chance. Let's remake this industry so all these people can have this chance. I'm sorry, but I don't care. And it's time we started to act like that. It's time when these people who don't deserve a chance get up on the stage, you don't give them a chance. I paid money for this entertainment. I want something appealing. Entertain me. And if you don't, quite simply, you're gonna get booed off of the stage. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, you can email me at rjs4thage@gmail.com if you want a copy of my graphic novel. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.